So a number of people have asked me on my thoughts and reflections with Jimmy Carter's recent passing. They're curious my evaluation. What do I think about Jimmy Carter? Now, at first glance, when I started thinking about this, my general approach is that, I don't talk politics. And that's something, if you've ever hung around the kollel around me, I try to really avoid politics. I talk about history and reflections and thoughts about historical figures and the like, but I really do try to keep out of politics. I don't want people to feel uncomfortable studying Torah, coming to the kollel because of a political position. We don't talk politics at the kollel. So my first gut reaction was, I'm not going to talk about Jimmy Carter. But then I started thinking, you know what? The reality is his administration was from 1976 to 1980. That's history. That's not current events. That's not politics. So I probably ought to weigh in on Jimmy Carter. But then I thought again, but I said, well, wait a minute. Most of his contributions, or certainly a major part of Jimmy Carter's historical legacy, is actually his post-presidency. It's what he did after leaving office. And in that sense, a lot of his thoughts, opinions, a lot of his activity really is current events. It really is politics. So once again, I'm like back to, no, I'm not going to talk about Jimmy Carter. But then I realized I always have a rule. I don't talk about politics. Try not to talk about politics, when it comes to Torah and teaching and things like that. I have one exception personally. My one exception, one area where I am very politically active and strong-minded, and if people find that off-putting, it is what it is, and that's when it comes to Israel. I am unapologetically pro-Israel, and if that makes people uncomfortable, that's it. I guess you're always still welcome to join for classes, but I will be unapologetically pro-Israel, and that's something I've always maintained. And so even it got me thinking about Jimmy Carter, and yes, a lot of his activities could be considered, politics, current events, and usually those are types of things I try to shy away from. But one area where I'm unapologetic is about my pro-Israel feelings and sentiments. And with that said, what are my evaluations about Jimmy Carter? What do I think about Jimmy Carter as a president, as a person, as an activist? Well, I think I probably follow what many, if not most, Jews feel, and that is we did not like Jimmy Carter very much. He was incredibly antagonistic to Israel. He was really awful to the state of Israel during his presidency and even more so in his post-presidency. I mean, his book, Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid, is a horrible, horrible book. There's no way around it. It's such a terrible book. It puts Israel in such a negative light. His attitudes and approaches to Israel and the conflict in the Middle East are so anti-Zionist, so anti-Israel, and frankly, I think they're anti-Semitic. And because of that, I really strongly dislike Jimmy Carter's approach and his philosophies and his politics. He was anti-Israel. What he did to promote anti-Israelness, I find abhorrent, and there's no way around that. And that's something that I'm, comfortable saying from the pulpit. What he did to, it's interesting even within the Democratic Party for the longest of times, Jimmy Carter's negative approach to Israel has kind of been to the extreme. And, it's interesting. We talk about anti-Semitism on the rise. Anti-Semitism comes in all different types of flavors and political backgrounds, and to the right, to the left, to the middle. Anti-Semites come in many, many, many different stripes and colors, and anti-Israel sentiments come in many, many stripes and colors. And, within the Democratic Party over the last many years, the mainstream Democratic Party has not really embraced, thank God, Jimmy Carter's anti-Israel rhetoric and anti-Israel approach for the most part. We've seen in the last few years, certainly since October 7th, we've certainly seen a rise of that, and that's certainly something that's very worrisome. And frankly, Jimmy Carter's extremism, extreme anti-Israel attitudes have really been leading the way for that to start creeping in, even within the mainstream, particularly in the political left. And because of that, again, what's my evaluation of Jimmy Carter? I really strongly dislike him. As a matter of fact, he's probably my least favorite president, certainly of the 20th century and perhaps of all time. Just because of all the anti-Israelness, I really strongly dislike him, and I do not find him a particularly good leader and a particularly good president. Aside from all the other elements of his presidency and politics, we can talk about the history, but just for this one issue alone, I really strongly dislike Jimmy Carter. But if we were to sort of just end there and say, all right, that's how we've evaluated Jimmy Carter, Rabbi Matt doesn't like Jimmy Carter because of his anti-Israel sentiments, I think we'd be missing a whole lot. I think we'd be missing a very important lesson, not just about Jimmy Carter, but perhaps more importantly, about how we evaluate people in general, and most importantly, how we evaluate ourselves. There is a fascinating medrash that talks about Paro. We all know the story of the Jews in Egypt and the oppression and all of the horrors that life was like when the Jews were in Mitzrayim, when the Jews were in Egypt. We know the Passover story, of course, the miracles, but it's all based on the story of the enslavement of the Jews and how the Jews were really mistreated. And of course, who was the leader of the Egyptians? It was the Pharaoh, it was Paro. He was a Rasha. He's a villain. He's the quintessential example of a Rasha Marusha, of a purely wicked villain of biblical proportions. We all know the story of the Pharaoh. We all know the story of the Rishus, of just how evil Paro was. We're all very familiar with that. But what the Medrash points out, which is so startling, is it really points out at the beginning of the story. We know, if we think about it, how did the Jews end up in Egypt in the first place? We know the story, how Yosef, he's the viceroy of Mitzrayim, of Egypt. That's a whole story in its own right we're all familiar with. And he really, if you think about it, he's the person leading Egypt and leading the Egyptian economy. He was a brilliant economist, and he saved Egypt from economic ruin. He was a savior for the Egyptians. He did so much to help the Egyptians. And according to at least some opinions, the same Paro, it was the same leader of the Egyptians who was around during Yosef's time. He is the same Paro that would ultimately enslave the Jewish people. And the Medrash points out, like, I guess if we take a step back, like, how could that be? How could you have a person, the Paro, who owed so much to Yosef, who must have been so appreciative to Yosef, who benefited so much from the Jewish involvement in the economy, and the Jews did so much to help him and his country? How could he turn around and become such a villain? As a matter of fact, the Medrash tells us that Paro initially, when he was approached by his advisors, and they came and told him, they suggested to him that they should begin enslaving the Jewish people, Paro himself said, how can we do such a thing? That's immoral. It lacks appreciation. Where's your gratitude? After all, Yosef, a generation earlier, had saved the Egypt and the Egyptians from economic collapse. It would be totally ungrateful to enslave the Jewish people. And he resisted his advisors and the leaders of Egypt. He resisted their plea to enslave the Jews. And matter of fact, the Medrash tells us the Pharaoh Paro, he was deposed. He was kicked out from being the Pharaoh, as it were. And he was deposed for 3 months until he finally cracked. I guess he missed living in the White House too much. And he eventually gave in, and he joined the crowd and became the evil Paro that we all know. And it's a really startling medrash. It's really remarkable. Think about it. We know Paro, and we think of Paro as this evil, horrific person. Yet, for 3 months, he had the courage to withstand social pressure of his leaders and advisors, not just to withstand the social pressure and all of that pushback, but he was actually willing to forgo and give up being the head of the Egyptian government. He was deposed and he gave up sitting on the throne. He was that willing to sacrifice to do that which was right. And it's a remarkable medrash. And the truth of the matter is, when you really stop, at least when I stop and think about that medrash, I really have a hard time with it. Because psychologically, how do I reconcile the fact that the Pharaoh, this evil, nefarious, evil villain who did so much harm and is such a Rasha, he's such a biblical villain of the highest order. How can I reconcile that with the fact that early on in his career, he actually had the courage to do that which was right? He did a real mitzvah. He did that which was appropriate. He was willing to give up so much. Ultimately, again, of course, he cracks, but how do we understand those 3 months? How do we understand the fact that Paro, who could be such an evil villain, was able to have the strength to stand up to do that which was right? The truth of the matter is, I think the Medrash is really highlighting such an important message and such an important idea. Psychologists call this cognitive dissonance theory. The reality is, it's not a contradiction. The Pharaoh did a horrific thing. He was the evil Paro. He was that Rasha Marusha. He was that villain of the highest order. He is the antagonist of the entire story of Pesach. He is that evil person. And he also did something that was very admirable. He had the courage to withstand that pressure. He stood up for what was right for 3 months. Cognitive dissonance theory basically argues that the reality is that people have conflicting realities all the time. You can have Paro being a terrible villain, and that is who he is. At the same time, he can also have done something that was very positive. Cognitive dissonance theory says we don't like having those two contradictory ideas psychologically. We have a very hard time holding on to that reality. When the truth of the matter is, that's all it is. It's a person who did two contradictory things. That happens all the time. But cognitive dissonance theory says psychologically, we have such a hard time accepting that. And consciously, but more often than not, it's subconsciously, we want to reduce that cognitive dissonance. We don't like those two dissonant ideas that Paro is an absolute pure villain, which he was, who also could have done a good thing once in his life. We don't like that tension. We don't like that psychological contradiction. And cognitive dissonance theory says when we have two dissonant ideas, we psychologically, usually subconsciously, we reduce that dissonance by ignoring or not focusing appropriately enough on one of those contradictory ideas. And what we'll usually do is we'll dismiss the fact that that Paro did something positive. We'll completely ignore the fact that Paro once in his life did a mitzvah. We just totally are blind to that reality. We choose to ignore it, we minimize it, or we just totally sweep it under the rug. We just can't deal psychologically on a subconscious level. We don't like dealing with those two contradictory ideas that Paro is a Rasha, he's a villain, and he also did something that was nice. But the truth of the matter is those two realities are actually the truth. He did do a mitzvah and he was a villain. And it's not helpful to I guess, as cognitive dissonance points out, the theory points out, to just reduce that dissonance by ignoring one of those realities. And the truth of the matter is, I was thinking about this medrash and this idea of Paro being such a villain, yet at the same time having done a mitzvah. I was thinking about this medrash and this lesson, and it struck me that's so true about Jimmy Carter. The truth of the matter is, if we look at Jimmy Carter's life, a couple of really admirable things emerge, and they are realities. Jimmy Carter was married to Rosalind. They were married for 77 years. Now, for me, that's an admirable thing. People who have long, healthy, stable marriages is such a beautiful thing. As a matter of fact, I've seen this all over the news. There are less than 1,000 people alive today in the entire United States that have been married for 75 years. It's unusual. First of all, you have to have obviously that longevity, but more than that, marriages nowadays are under attack and people don't stay married as often, as long as people used to. And that's something that I admired, that Jimmy Carter stayed married and had it, from at least what I can tell, seemed to be a very positive, happy marriage. The truth of the matter is, if I'm being honest, Jimmy Carter did a lot of amazing things. With the Carter Center, they did a lot of good work. There are so many war-torn countries that the world tends to ignore, we don't look at. And the Carter Center really did a lot, and still it does do a lot, to try to bring awareness and try to solve some of these conflicts in Africa and other places which the world ignores. They try to bring out bring peace to these places, and at least are trying to do something to really alleviate a lot of suffering. You look at his work for Habitat to Humanity. He really did give back a lot to a lot of people who are suffering. He's, through his centers and his work, they've cured diseases. They're stopping civil wars. They're really doing a lot of amazing stuff. And the reality is, when we think about the goods that Jimmy Carter has done, I have a hard time. I was thinking about evaluating Jimmy Carter. I say, but wait a minute. I view Jimmy Carter as a little bit of a villain in terms of all that he's done negative towards Israel. I view him as really a lousy person for the most part. Cognitive dissonance theory tells me that, and I've seen this with a lot of people, and a lot of people, I guess, who share my attitudes to Carter, and we dismiss all the good that he's done, that the Carter Center has done, Habitat for Humanity, all the positive work that he's done. We just dismiss it because, cognitive dissonance theory says if Jimmy Carter was such a bad person in terms of his attitudes to Israel, I'm going to ignore the fact that he may have done a couple of good things here on the side, to help society, to be a good, husband, or whatever those positive things were that he did. Cognitive dissonance theory tells us we want to reduce those two contradictory ideas, and we ignore and we dismiss and we reduce that tension by not saying it wasn't true, he didn't do it, or we don't care about it, or we don't give it the proper weight. And the truth of the matter is, it's not so helpful. If we take an honest approach, what we should do is we should say, he did all of those wonderful things, and that's great. He still was a villain. The two things don't have anything to do with one another. He did a couple of wonderful things that are admirable. He's still the same villain. He still had committed those terrible sins in terms of his anti-Israel sentiment and rhetoric. One has nothing to do with the other. And it's such an important lesson. But the truth of the matter is, it's not just about Jimmy Carter and how we evaluate Jimmy Carter. I think it's so much more germane, and it's actually really relevant when we look inward and how we evaluate ourselves. You see, it's very easy to have this cognitive dissonance when it comes to how we look at our own lives. For some people, we think I'm a wonderful guy. I'm a great person. I'm such a good person. I give back to society. I do so many mitzvahs. I'm such a wonderful person. And because we view ourselves in such a good light, it can be very easy for us to ignore the fact that we've got some shortcomings in our lives. The fact that I may be doing a couple things that I shouldn't be so proud of. Cognitive dissonance theory tells us, well, wait a minute, how can I be a good person who's done some bad at the same time? And because of cognitive dissonance, we want to reduce those dissonant ideas, and we very likely might ignore the fact that I've got some improvement. And I just view myself, I'm a tzaddik gamor. I'm such a righteous person. Look at all these wonderful things that I've done. And we don't look enough at the bad or the things that we need to improve in our lives because we just dismiss it psychologically. We don't put enough weight on those areas of improvement. But I think even more common, at least in my experience, what's far more common is when it goes the other way. So often I meet people, and for myself also in many instances, I'm overly harsh on myself. I look at all my shortcomings, my failures, my mistakes, all the things that are going wrong in my life, and I look at myself and I'm like, oh, I'm a failure, or I stink, or I'm not so good. And I have this negative approach to my life and how I view myself. When the truth of the matter is, I've also done a lot of positive and a lot of good as well. But cognitive dissonance theory says I might disproportionately look at all the bad and define myself as I'm a bad person or I've got all these flaws, and I ignore all the positivity in my life. I ignore all the good that I'm doing. I ignore all the mitzvahs because it's hard for me to maintain those two contradictory ideas. And I just label myself as no good, not good enough, not worthy, failure. And that's not healthy either. We need to fight cognitive dissonance. It's not correct. It's not true, and it's not helpful. The honest truth is we're a mix. We've got a lot of good going on in our lives. We've got room for improvement. We need to be in touch and honest with ourselves to recognize there's good in our lives and there's bad in our lives as well. We can't let cognitive dissonance allow us to ignore what's going positive in our lives. This holds true about Jimmy Carter. It's true about the Pharaoh, but it's so much more true about ourselves. We need to learn that lesson from Paro. We need to learn that lesson from evaluating Jimmy Carter's life to realize we are all big mixes of both good and bad. Let's not ignore the good. Let's not ignore the bad. Let's not reduce ourselves to just being villains and heroes. The truth of the matter is we're all far, far more complicated than that.